You're wasting our time. If you're not buying, you need to leave." The sentence didn't just land, it echoed, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the quiet luxury of the showroom like it had been practiced before, like it belonged there more than the man it was aimed at, and for a brief moment, everything else, the polished marble floors, the soft overhead lighting, the faint scent of leather and new engines, fell into the background as every eye turned toward the scene unfolding near the center of the room where Darius Cole stood, still and composed, dressed in a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, nothing flashy, nothing that signaled power, nothing that matched the six-figure price tag surrounding him, and yet there was something about the way he stood, grounded, unbothered, as if the room itself had adjusted around him rather than the other way around. Ethan Whitmore, the showroom manager, adjusted his cufflinks as he stepped closer. His expression tight with controlled irritation, the kind that came from believing you were absolutely right. "This section is for serious buyers," he added, his voice dropping just enough to feel personal. "People who actually belong here." And a quiet ripple moved through the nearby customers, a few subtle smirks, a glance exchanged between a couple standing beside a midnight blue coupe, one of them already raising a phone just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to capture what might turn into something worth sharing. Darius didn't respond right away. Didn't rush to defend himself, didn't raise his voice or shift his posture, he simply looked around, slow and deliberate, taking in the showroom like a man studying details others overlooked, the reflections on the cars, the positioning of the sales desks, the subtle tension now thick in the air, and when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost measured. "Is there a problem?" It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't defensive, it was something else entirely, something that made Ethan pause for half a second longer than he intended before responding. "The problem," Ethan said, now louder, reclaiming the room, "is that you're in a place you clearly can't afford." And that was the moment the atmosphere shifted again, not louder, not chaotic, but heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. A young sales associate near the back hesitated, eyes flicking between Darius and the manager, sensing something off but saying nothing, while the faint hum of the showroom lights seemed suddenly louder in the silence that followed. Darius let the words settle, didn't interrupt, didn't react the way anyone expected him to, and that calm, that refusal to escalate, only made the tension sharper, more visible, more uncomfortable for everyone watching, because this wasn't how these moments usually went. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a quiet stillness that felt like the edge of something bigger, something unseen, and as Ethan took another step forward, confident he had already won the interaction, already defined the narrative, he reached out slightly, gesturing toward the exit with a firm, practiced motion. "Let's not make this a scene," he said, but what he didn't realize, not yet, was that the scene had already begun, and the man he was trying to remove wasn't reacting because he was unsure of himself. He was waiting, calculating, letting every word, every glance, every assumption stack up, piece by piece, until the moment they would all come crashing down. The silence did not break after Ethan's gesture toward the door. It stretched, thin and tight, like a wire pulled too far, and Darius Cole did not move, not an inch, not a shift of weight, not even a glance toward the exit that had just been offered to him like a final decision already made on his behalf. Instead, he let his gaze drift across the showroom again, slower this time, more intentional, as if each second mattered. As if every detail he was taking in would be used later, and that subtle change, that quiet refusal to comply without resistance, began to unsettle the room in a way no argument ever could. A man near the front desk cleared his throat, uncomfortable, while the woman beside him lowered her voice and whispered, "Why is he still standing there?" As if the answer should have been obvious, as if this moment should have ended already, but it had not, and that was the problem. Ethan noticed it too, the shift, the hesitation in the air, and his tone sharpened to compensate. "Sir, I am not going to repeat myself," he said, louder now, drawing more attention, reclaiming authority not through reason but volume. "This is private property, and we reserve the right to refuse service." The words sounded official, rehearsed, like something said before, but this time they landed differently, heavier, because they were no longer just directed at Darius, they were being performed for everyone watching. A young employee behind the counter froze mid-motion, her hands hovering over a keyboard as she glanced at the system screen, then back at Darius, then at Ethan, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and concern. Like she was sensing a disconnect she could not yet explain. Darius finally shifted, but only slightly, just enough to turn his body fully toward Ethan, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. "You already made your decision," he said, his voice even, steady, not loud but somehow carrying through the room without effort. "Before you knew anything about me." And for a brief second, that sentence lingered, not as a challenge, but as a statement, simple and undeniable. Ethan let out a short breath, dismissive, shaking his head as if the conversation was beneath him. "I know enough," he replied, the confidence in his tone returning, reinforced by the presence of the crowd, by the assumption that he was still in control. "I see this all the time." And that phrase, that casual generalization, hung in the air longer than he intended, because it said more than he realized. In the far corner, a customer who had been quietly observing raised his phone a little higher now, no longer pretending not to record, while another man leaned against the display car, arms crossed, watching with narrowed eyes, not entertained anymore, but attentive, like he was waiting for something to shift. Darius heard the words, all of them, and for a moment, something flickered behind his calm expression, not anger, not frustration, but recognition, like a memory brushing against the present, and he did not rush to speak again. He let that recognition settle. Let it align with the moment unfolding in front of him, because this was not new, not unfamiliar, not unexpected. It was a pattern, one he had seen before in different rooms, under different lights, with different faces, but always the same tone, the same assumption, the same quiet dismissal disguised as policy. Ethan took another step forward, closing the space between them just enough to reassert dominance without crossing into anything obvious, his voice lower now, controlled. "Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, and there was an edge to it now, a subtle impatience creeping in, because the situation was no longer resolving as quickly as he had planned. Darius met his gaze fully, no hesitation, no avoidance. Just a steady look that did not challenge but did not yield either, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most, not defiance, but the absence of submission, the absence of reaction he could control. Behind them, the system at the front desk blinked again, a small notification appearing on the screen that the young employee had not yet touched, her eyes widening slightly as she leaned closer, reading something she did not understand, while the room, still and watching, hovered on the edge of something none of them could yet name, but all of them could feel. The notification did not disappear from the screen, it stayed there, small but persistent, like a quiet signal that something deeper had just been triggered beneath the surface, and the young employee behind the counter felt it before she understood it, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if touching anything might make it worse, her eyes scanning the line of text again, then again, as if it might change if she looked long enough. But it did not. Across the room, Ethan was still speaking. Still holding on to the version of the moment he believed he controlled. "I am giving you one last opportunity," he said, his voice firm, measured, but now edged with something less certain, something that had not been there a minute ago. "Leave on your own, or I will have security escort you out." And the word security landed differently this time, not as authority, but as escalation, a line drawn in front of witnesses who were no longer neutral. Darius did not respond immediately. He let the silence absorb the threat, let it settle into the room where everyone could feel it, and in that silence, something else began to grow, not loud, not visible, but undeniable, a shift in who held the weight of the moment. Near the back, the customer who had been recording lowered his phone slightly, not because he lost interest, but because something about this no longer felt like spectacle. It felt like something unfolding. Something real, something with consequences. The young employee finally spoke, her voice hesitant but clear enough to cut through the tension. "Sir?" she said, looking directly at Ethan, not at Darius. "There is a system alert on the main account." And that sentence, simple as it was, cracked the rhythm of the scene in a way nothing else had. because it did not belong to the script Ethan had been following. Ethan turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Handle it," he said quickly, dismissively, as if it were a distraction, something beneath his attention. But the employee did not move. She stayed exactly where she was, her eyes still on the screen, then slowly lifted her gaze back to him. "It is not a normal alert," she added, quieter now, but somehow more urgent. "It is ownership level access." And the words did not land all at once, they unfolded piece by piece, like something being revealed too slowly for comfort. Ethan frowned, confusion flickering beneath his composure. "What does that even mean?" he asked, the question sharper than he intended, because now it was not just about Darius. It was about something he did not understand, something outside his control. Darius watched the exchange without interruption, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, but there was a subtle shift now, not in his stance, but in the way he occupied the space, like the room had begun to recognize him before the people in it did. The employee swallowed, glancing back at the screen as if confirming what she already knew. "It means someone with full ownership privileges just accessed this location system," she said, and this time, the room reacted, not loudly, but visibly, shoulders stiffening, eyes narrowing, attention sharpening as the weight of those words began to settle. Ethan laughed once, short and forced. "That is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, trying to restore the narrative he had been building, trying to anchor himself back in certainty. "Corporate does not just log into a showroom system without notice." But even as he said it, his voice lacked the conviction it had carried before. Darius took a single step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance slightly, enough to shift the focus back onto him without demanding it, and when he spoke, his tone remained calm, almost reflective. "You said you have seen this before," he said, repeating Ethan's earlier words with quiet precision. "People who do not belong." And the room leaned in again, drawn not by volume, but by the clarity of what was being said. Ethan did not answer right away, because for the first time since the moment began, he was no longer sure what the correct response was, no longer sure which version of the situation he was in, and that uncertainty, subtle but real, began to show. Darius held his gaze, steady and unbroken, and added, just as evenly, "Then maybe this time, you should look again." And the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was charged, waiting, as if the next few seconds would decide everything. The silence did not fade after Darius spoke, it deepened, like the entire showroom had stepped into a moment it could not step back from, and for the first time since this began, Ethan Whitmore did not immediately respond, his expression tightening as his eyes flicked toward the front desk, toward the screen he had dismissed seconds earlier, and something in that glance gave him away, not fear, not yet, but doubt. Subtle and unfamiliar, creeping into a space where certainty had always lived. The young employee did not look away from the monitor this time, her voice steadier now, more anchored in what she was seeing than what she was feeling. "It is still active," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone within earshot heard it. "The system is being accessed in real time." And that phrase shifted the room again, because now this was not just a misunderstanding, not just a customer dispute. It was something bigger, something operational, something that did not care about assumptions or appearances. Ethan stepped toward the desk, quicker now, his composure adjusting to this new variable. "Move," he said, not harsh, but firm, and the employee stepped aside, watching him as he leaned in toward the screen, his eyes scanning the interface with practiced familiarity, looking for something that would restore control, something that would confirm this was an error, a glitch, anything that would put the situation back into a category he understood. But the longer he looked, the less certain he became, because the system was not broken, it was responding, and it was responding to something above his level. Behind him, the low murmur of the showroom had shifted into something quieter, more focused, the kind of silence that came when people realized they were witnessing a moment that would not repeat, a moment that would define everything that came after it. Darius remained where he was, not approaching, not retreating, simply present, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, But there was a weight to that stillness now, a gravity that had not been visible before, as if the room itself was beginning to adjust to him rather than the other way around. Ethan straightened slowly, his jaw tightening as he turned back, trying to rebuild the authority he had been standing on minutes earlier. "This does not change anything," he said, but the sentence landed differently than the ones before it, thinner, less grounded, because now it was not supported by certainty, only by habit. Darius tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just observant, as if he were watching Ethan reach for something that was no longer there. "It changes everything," he replied, his voice still even, still controlled, but now carrying a clarity that cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could. A man near the display cars shifted his stance, no longer leaning casually, now standing upright, attentive, while the customer who had been recording lowered his phone completely, no longer documenting, now watching, fully present in what was unfolding. At the front desk, the employee spoke again, more certain now, reading directly from the screen. "Authorization level, owner verified," she said, each word landing with increasing weight, until the last one settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing immediate to say, no prepared line for this, no script that accounted for the ground shifting beneath him in real time, and for a brief moment, the roles in the room inverted without announcement, without permission. Simply because the truth had entered the space and refused to be ignored. Darius took one slow step forward, not to dominate the space, but to claim it, to stand in alignment with what was already happening rather than forcing it, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just undeniable. "You asked me to leave a place you thought I did not belong," he said, his eyes steady on Ethan. "But you never asked the one question that would have saved you." And the room, silent and watching, seemed to lean into that sentence, waiting for what came next, because whatever it was, it would not just explain the moment, it would redefine it. No one moved after those words, not immediately, because the weight of what Darius had just said did not hit all at once. It spread slowly, like a realization working its way through every person in the room, and for the first time since this began, the attention was no longer scattered, it was unified, every set of eyes locked on the same point, waiting, measuring, recalibrating what they thought they understood. Ethan Whitmore stood there, his posture still upright, still trying to hold on to the authority he had been operating from, but there was a hesitation now, a slight delay between thought and action that had not existed before, and it showed, not in what he said, but in what he did not say. Behind him, the young employee stepped closer to the screen again, her voice quieter now but more certain, as if she had crossed a line internally and could not step back. "The credentials are not just active," she said, reading carefully. "They are overriding local control." And that phrase did not sound like something meant for customers, it sounded internal, procedural, something that belonged in meetings, not in moments like this, and that contrast only made it land harder. A man near the entrance shifted his stance, no longer casual, now fully engaged, while a woman beside him folded her arms, her earlier expression of amusement replaced with something more serious, something closer to recognition. Darius remained steady, not reacting to the growing attention, not acknowledging the shift directly, because he did not need to. The room was already doing that for him, piece by piece, without instruction. Ethan finally spoke, but the tone had changed, less sharp, more controlled, as if he were choosing his words more carefully now. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," he began, the confidence in his voice no longer absolute, "we can resolve it privately." And that suggestion, that quiet pivot away from the public confrontation he had created, did not go unnoticed, not by the room, and certainly not by Darius. Darius looked at him for a moment, not interrupting, letting the suggestion exist fully before responding, and when he did, his voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that cut through any attempt to redirect the moment. "You made this public," he said simply, "before you had the facts." And that sentence settled into the space like a mirror being held up, reflecting not just the action, but the intention behind it. The employee at the desk spoke again, this time unable to hold back the urgency in her tone. "There is more," she said, her eyes widening slightly as she scrolled. "The system is pulling employee records, access logs, internal complaints." And now the room reacted more visibly, a low murmur rippling through the crowd, because this was no longer about a single interaction. It was expanding, reaching into areas that suggested something deeper, something systemic. Ethan turned sharply toward her. "Stop reading that out loud," he said, the command quick, instinctive, but it came too late. The information was already in the air, already shaping how the moment was being understood. Darius took another slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to make his presence undeniable, not aggressive, not forceful, just aligned with the shift that was already happening. And when he spoke again, it was not to escalate, but to clarify. "You assumed you were protecting this place," he said, his eyes steady. "But you never asked who built it." And that question did not demand an answer, it exposed the absence of one. Near the front, the customer who had been recording lowered his phone completely now, his expression no longer curious, but focused. Like someone witnessing something that would not need a replay to be remembered. The employee looked back at the screen one more time, then at Darius, then at Ethan, and in that glance, something passed between awareness and confirmation, something unspoken but understood, and the room, now fully still, hovered on the edge of the moment where everything that had been assumed would be replaced by what was about to be revealed. The room did not feel like a showroom anymore, it felt like something else entirely, like a space that had shifted from transaction to truth, and no one seemed willing to break that tension first, not even Ethan Whitmore, who now stood caught between two versions of reality, the one he had created minutes ago and the one unfolding in front of him without his permission. His eyes moved again, not confidently this time, but searching. From Darius to the front desk, then back again, trying to find a foothold, something stable, something he could still control, but every second that passed without resolution made that harder. The young employee took a slow breath, then spoke again, her voice no longer hesitant, but grounded in what she was seeing. "The system just escalated the access level," she said, reading carefully. "This is not a remote check, it is a live administrative override." And those words landed differently, because they carried authority of their own, not emotional, not subjective, but factual, and facts did not bend to perception. A subtle ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, but undeniable, shoulders straightening, expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding, because now the pattern was becoming visible, not just to one person, but to everyone. Darius remained exactly where he was, but the room no longer saw him the same way. Not as someone out of place, but as someone central to whatever was happening. And that shift, quiet as it was, redefined everything without a single announcement. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, then straightened his posture again, attempting to rebuild what had already begun to slip. "If there is a system issue," he said, his voice measured, carefully chosen, "we will contact corporate and resolve it through the proper channels." But even as he spoke, it was clear he was reacting, not leading, responding to something already in motion rather than directing it. Darius listened, allowing the sentence to finish, allowing the attempt to redirect to fully form before answering, and when he did, his voice carried a quiet certainty that did not need reinforcement. "You are already speaking to the highest channel in this company," he said, and the simplicity of that statement did more than any explanation could. It did not argue, it did not prove, it simply existed, and in that existence, it dismantled everything Ethan had been relying on. The employee behind the desk looked up slowly, her eyes moving from the screen to Darius, then back again, as if the connection between the two had just become undeniable, her voice softer now, but filled with realization. "The credentials match, full ownership authorization," she said, almost to herself, but loud enough for the room to hear, and that was the moment the shift completed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but definitively. A man near the entrance shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in recognition, while another customer stepped back half a step, creating space where there had been none, as if the room itself was adjusting its distance from Darius in response to what had just been understood. Ethan did not move right away, because movement required certainty, and certainty was no longer something he had. His earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, more fragile, something that could not withstand another misstep. Darius took one final step forward, closing the space just enough to stand where the center of the room now naturally formed around him, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, just final. "You did not make a mistake because you did not know who I was," he said, his eyes steady. "You made it because you decided who I was before you ever asked." And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with the weight of everything that had just been revealed, and the understanding that whatever came next would not be a correction, it would be a consequence. No one spoke after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word now carried consequence, and the room understood it, even if no one had said it out loud. The weight of Darius's statement did not fade, it settled, deep and undeniable, and for the first time since the moment began, the power in the room was no longer assumed, it was visible. Ethan Whitmore stood there, still facing him. But something had changed in the way he held himself, the sharp edges of his confidence softened into something uncertain, something searching for footing that no longer existed, and his silence was no longer control, it was hesitation. Behind the desk, the young employee did not look at Ethan anymore, her attention fixed entirely on the screen as new lines continued to populate, her voice quieter now, but steadier than it had ever been. "The system is logging internal actions," she said, almost as if she were reading for herself. "Timestamps, access levels, recorded interactions." And she paused, just long enough for the meaning of that to sink in, before adding, "Everything happening right now is being documented." And that sentence did what no raised voice could, it shifted the room from observation to awareness, because now this was not just a moment, it was a record, a man near the back straightened fully, no longer leaning against the car beside him, while a woman closer to the front lowered her arms slowly, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if she was recalculating everything she had just witnessed. Darius did not acknowledge the growing attention, he did not need to, because the room was already adjusting around him, aligning itself with the truth that had surfaced, piece by piece. Without force, Ethan finally spoke, but the tone was different now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "If there has been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice measured, controlled, but lacking the edge it once carried, "we can correct it immediately." And the shift in language did not go unnoticed, not by the people in the room, and certainly not by Darius. Darius let the words settle, did not interrupt, did not challenge, he simply listened, and that listening, that refusal to rush, made the moment feel even heavier, because it allowed the contrast to exist fully between what had been said before and what was being said now. When he responded, his voice remained calm, but there was a precision to it now, a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "This was not a misunderstanding," he said, and the sentence landed with quiet force. "This was a decision." And the difference between those two words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. At the front desk, the employee looked up again, this time directly at Ethan, not with defiance, but with something closer to recognition. "There are prior reports," she said, her voice steady. "Similar complaints, same language, same outcomes." And the room reacted again, more visibly this time, a low murmur rising, because now the moment had expanded beyond itself. It was no longer isolated, it was part of something larger. Ethan turned toward her quickly. "That is internal information," he said, his tone tightening again. But it no longer held authority, it sounded defensive, reactive, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Darius took one slow step forward, not to confront, but to stand fully within the center of what was unfolding, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, controlled, but final. "You thought this was about one customer," he said, his eyes locked on Ethan. "But it never was." And the silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore, it felt resolved, like a line had been drawn not by force, but by truth, and everyone in the room knew, without needing to be told, that whatever came next would not be about fixing what had happened, it would be about answering for it. For a moment, the showroom disappeared for him, not physically, but in the way memory can step in and take over the present without asking, and Darius Cole stood there, eyes steady, posture unchanged, but somewhere beneath that stillness, something older surfaced, something familiar, something that had shaped the man now standing in that room. He was 19 again, standing in a different showroom, smaller, less polished. The air heavier with expectation and doubt, wearing his best shirt. Freshly pressed, shoes that had been cleaned twice that morning just to make sure they looked right, and still, it had not been enough, because before he could even ask a question, before he could even touch the door handle fully, a voice had stopped him. "We are closed," the man had said, without checking the time, without checking anything, and when Darius pointed to the sign that clearly showed they were open, the man had not corrected himself, he had simply added, "Not for browsing." And that sentence, casual and dismissive, had stayed with him longer than the moment itself. He remembered standing there, not arguing, not pushing back, just absorbing it, the same way he was now, quiet, controlled, but fully aware of what was being said without being said. Back then, he had walked away, not because he agreed, but because he understood something deeper. That the room had already decided who he was before he had a chance to show them anything different, and that understanding had not broken him, it had built him, shaped him, sharpened him into someone who would never need to argue for belonging again, because he would own the space instead. The memory faded, not abruptly, but naturally, like a wave receding, and the showroom returned, clearer now, sharper, every detail back in place, every face still watching, but now, the past and the present were aligned, not separate moments, but part of the same pattern, the same script playing out with different names, different faces, different walls. Darius did not show any of this outwardly, his expression remained calm, unreadable, but there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, not in emotion, but in certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, not just in the room, but in the story unfolding around you. The air felt different now, heavier, more deliberate, as if the room itself had slowed to match the weight of what was happening, and even the people watching seemed to sense it, their movements quieter, their attention sharper, no longer reacting, but absorbing. Ethan Whitmore remained in front of him, still trying to hold on to control, but the space between them had changed, not physically, but in meaning, because it was no longer a gap between a manager and a customer, it was something else entirely, something that had not yet been fully spoken, but was already understood. The young employee behind the desk glanced once more at the screen, then at Darius. Her expression no longer confused, but certain, as if the system had confirmed what the room was only beginning to realize. Darius finally spoke again, his voice steady, calm, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, not louder, not sharper, just heavier with truth. "This is not new," he said, and the words were not directed at Ethan alone, but at the room itself, at the pattern, at the repetition of something that had gone unchallenged for too long. "It just feels different when it does not go the way you expect." And that sentence did not accuse, it revealed, it connected the past to the present in a way that did not need explanation. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with recognition, with realization, with the understanding that what was happening in that moment was not isolated, it was part of something larger, something that had finally reached a point where it could no longer continue unchanged. And as Darius stood there, unmoved, unshaken, the room began to understand that this was not just about what had happened, it was about what had always been happening, and what was about to change because of it. The realization did not explode, it unfolded, slow and irreversible, like a door opening that no one in the room could close again. And Darius Cole did not rush it, he did not force the moment forward, he simply reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with a calm precision that felt almost quiet compared to the weight of what it carried, he tapped once and raised it to his ear, his voice steady, controlled. "Initiate full operational audit for this location," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, as if this were routine, as if moments like this had protocols already waiting for them. "I want live review of staff conduct, access logs, and customer interaction records, effective immediately." And there was no hesitation in his tone, no need for explanation, because the authority behind those words did not come from volume, it came from certainty. The room did not react all at once, but you could feel it, the shift from confusion to comprehension, as if the invisible structure of power had just been made visible in real time, and people were adjusting to it. Recalibrating what they thought they understood about who stood in front of them. At the front desk, the system responded instantly, new windows opening, alerts stacking, the interface no longer passive, but active, alive with processes that did not wait for approval from anyone in that room, and the young employee stepped back slightly, her eyes widening as she watched it unfold, her voice barely above a whisper now. "It is executing, system-wide," she said, not to Ethan, not to Darius, but to the moment itself. Ethan Whitmore stood still, his earlier confidence now replaced with something far more fragile, not fear, but exposure, the kind that comes when control slips not through force, but through truth, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, because nothing he had prepared applied anymore. Darius lowered his phone slowly, not with urgency, not with emphasis, just placing it back into his pocket as if the most important part of the moment had already happened, and everything else was simply the consequence unfolding. He looked at Ethan. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is what accountability looks like," he said, his voice even, measured, but carrying a finality that settled into the room like a closing statement. Behind them, the low murmur of the showroom had disappeared completely, replaced by a silence that was no longer uncertain, but aware, every person present now understanding that they were not just watching a situation resolve, they were witnessing something being exposed. The employee at the desk glanced between the screen and Darius again, then finally spoke, her voice steadier than before, anchored by what she now knew to be true. "All activity is being logged to corporate oversight," she said. "Nothing can be altered or removed." And that sentence did not just describe a system, it defined the moment, because it meant that what had happened here would not fade, would not be rewritten, would not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Ethan took a small step back, almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the shift, the loss of ground he could not recover, and for the first time since the interaction began, he was not leading, not controlling, not even responding, he was simply present in a reality he did not choose. Darius remained steady, unmoved. His presence now fully aligned with the authority the room had come to recognize, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper. Just unmistakable. "You believe this was a place you managed," he said, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "But it has always been a place you were trusted to represent." And the difference between those two things hung in the air, clear and undeniable. The system continued to update behind them, quiet but relentless, each new line reinforcing what had already been set in motion, and as the seconds passed, the room did not return to what it had been, because it could not, it had crossed the threshold, and there was no version of this moment that led back to ignorance, only forward into consequence. The system did not slow down, it did not hesitate, it continued to process in real time, each update appearing on the screen like a quiet confirmation that something far larger than the room had already taken control, and Darius Cole stood at the center of it, not reacting to the movement, not chasing it, because he was not waiting for the system to prove anything, he already knew what it would reveal. The young employee's voice came again, clearer now, no longer uncertain. "Corporate oversight has acknowledged the audit," she said, her eyes scanning the incoming lines. "Executive board access is now linked to this location." And the words landed with a different kind of weight, not emotional, not dramatic, but absolute, because they meant. This moment was no longer contained within these walls, it had reached beyond them, into a space where decisions were not debated, they were executed. Ethan Whitmore felt it before he fully understood it, the shift from local authority to something far above him, and his posture adjusted again, subtly, as if his body had recognized what his mind was still trying to process. "We can resolve this internally," he said quickly, the urgency in his voice breaking through the control he had tried to maintain. "There is no need to escalate further." But even as he spoke, the contradiction was clear, it was already escalated, already beyond him, already moving in a direction he could not redirect, Darius let the words exist without interruption, allowing the contrast to become visible to everyone watching, and when he responded, his voice remained calm, but there was no softness left in it, only clarity. "You escalated this the moment you decided I did not belong here," he said, and the sentence did not accuse, it defined, it placed responsibility exactly where it had been created. The room absorbed it in silence. No murmurs now, no whispers, just stillness, because there was nothing left to question, only something to witness. Behind them, the system shifted again, and this time the employee did not need to read it aloud for its meaning to be understood. Her eyes widened, then she looked up slowly, her voice steady but carrying a new level of gravity. "Access credentials for management are being reviewed," she said. "Active permissions are under evaluation." And that sentence did not just describe a process, it signaled a turning point, the beginning of consequence, not as a reaction, but as a result. Ethan took a step back without realizing it, the distance between him and Darius no longer something he controlled, but something he retreated into, and for the first time, his silence was not strategic, it was uncertain, filled with the awareness that whatever came next would not be shaped by him. Darius remained where he was, not advancing, not pressing, because he did not need to. The moment was already moving in his direction, guided not by force, but by truth, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but final in a way that left no space for reversal. "This is not about removing you," he said, his eyes steady. "It is about revealing you." And the difference between those two things settled into the room like a line that could not be crossed back over. A man near the entrance exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it, while another customer lowered his gaze briefly, processing what had just been said, not as entertainment, but as something real, something that carried weight beyond this moment. The employee looked back at the screen one more time, then spoke again, her voice firm now, grounded in certainty. "Executive confirmation received," she said. "Final decisions pending." And the room understood, without needing further explanation, that whatever came next would not be a continuation of what had been, it would be a conclusion. And as Darius stood there, steady and unshaken, the truth that had entered the room minutes ago now fully occupied it, leaving no space for anything else to take its place. The room did not move forward, it held, suspended in that final moment before something irreversible takes place, and every person inside it felt the same quiet pressure building, not from noise, not from confrontation, but from the certainty that whatever came next would not just change the situation, it would define it. Darius Cole stood exactly where he had been, unmoved, grounded, his presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, but fully recognized, even by those who had not yet spoken it out loud. And across from him, Ethan Whitmore remained still, his earlier authority no longer something he carried, but something that had been stripped away piece by piece without a single raised voice. The system behind the desk continued its silent work, lines updating, permissions shifting, and then it happened, not with a sound, not with a warning, but with a change so small it could have been missed if not for what it meant. The young employee's screen refreshed, and her eyes locked onto the new status displayed in front of her, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of finality. "Manager access revoked," she said, and the words did not echo, they settled, deep and immediate, into the space between everyone present. Ethan did not react right away, because reaction requires denial first, and denial had nowhere to stand anymore. His gaze flicked toward the screen, then back to Darius, and in that brief movement, everything he had relied on before, the authority, the assumption, the control, it all dissolved into something else entirely, something quieter, something far more real. A man near the entrance shifted his stance again, this time not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, while another customer let out a slow breath, as if releasing tension that had been building since the first word was spoken. Darius did not step forward, did not press the moment, because he did not need to, the consequence had already arrived, and it did not require his reinforcement, it existed on its own. The employee spoke again, her voice now firm, no hesitation, no uncertainty. "All supervisory privileges have been reassigned." She continued, reading directly from the system. Temporary control has been transferred to executive oversight. And that sentence completed what the room had already begun to understand, that this was no longer a question of what might happen, it was a confirmation of what already had. Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, not dramatically, not visibly to someone not paying attention, but enough to signal the shift, the moment where resistance gives way to realization, and he opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words followed, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. Darius finally took one slow step forward, not to dominate, not to intimidate, but to stand fully in the space that had now aligned with him, and when he spoke, his voice was calm. Measured, but unmistakably final. "This is what happens when assumption replaces judgment," he said, his eyes steady. "You stop seeing people, and you start seeing what you expect." And the sentence did not accuse, it explained, it clarified what had already been revealed. The room absorbed it completely, no movement, no distraction, just stillness, because everyone present understood that this was no longer about a single interaction, it was about something larger, something that had just been exposed in a way that could not be undone. Behind the desk, the system settled into its new state, no longer updating rapidly, but holding steady, as if the decision had been made and recorded beyond reversal, and the employee looked up one last time, her gaze moving from the screen to Darius, then briefly to Ethan, before resting somewhere in between, as if acknowledging both what had been and what now was. Darius remained still. For a moment longer, allowing the weight of everything to fully land, and then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he added one final line, simple and clear. "You did not lose control today," he said. "You revealed you never had it." And the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, because there was nothing left to uncover, only the consequences already unfolding in plain sight. The room did not erupt, it did not celebrate, it did not react with noise or movement, because what had just happened did not call for reaction, it demanded recognition, and that recognition settled into every corner of the showroom like something permanent, something that would not fade once the moment passed. Ethan Whitmore remained standing where he was, but he no longer occupied the space the same way. The authority he once carried replaced by a stillness that was no longer control, but consequence, and for the first time since the interaction began, he did not look at Darius directly, his gaze lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding, the kind that comes too late to change anything. Behind the desk, the system continued to hold its new state, no longer shifting, no longer updating rapidly, because the decision had already been executed, and the young employee, now fully aware of what she had witnessed, spoke again, her voice steady, grounded and final. "Confirmation. Employment status has been updated," she said. "Managerial role terminated, effective immediately." And the words did not need emphasis, they carried their own weight, final and irreversible. A quiet shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but visible in the way people stood, in the way they looked at Darius now, not as a stranger, not as a disruption, but as the center of a truth that had just unfolded in front of them without force, without argument, without spectacle. One of the customers near the front took a small step back, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, creating space that had not existed before, while another lowered his gaze briefly, processing the moment not as entertainment, but as something real, something that carried meaning beyond the walls of the showroom. Darius remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, not triumphant, not satisfied, just steady, because this had never been about proving himself, it had been about revealing something that had already been there. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority it once held. "I did not know," he said, the sentence simple, but heavy with everything it implied, and for a brief moment, it hung in the air, not as a defense, but as an explanation that arrived too late to matter. Darius looked at him, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that made the response inevitable. "That was never the problem," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "You acted like you already knew." And the distinction between those two things settled into the room with precision, leaving no space for misunderstanding. The employee behind the desk glanced once more at the system, then stepped slightly forward, her voice now firm, aligned with the authority that had been established. "Temporary management control has been reassigned," she said. "All staff are now under executive review until further notice." And that sentence expanded the moment beyond one person, beyond one action, into something larger, something that would continue long after this room returned to silence. Darius took one final look around the showroom, not scanning, not evaluating, but acknowledging, as if recognizing the space for what it was, not just a place of business, but a place where something had just been exposed and corrected without chaos, without force. Simply by allowing the truth to surface. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm weight it had from the beginning, but now it felt complete. "Respect is not proven by who you recognize," he said, his eyes steady. "It is revealed by how you treat those you do not." And the words did not echo, they settled, final and clear. No one responded, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing left to add, nothing left to question, only something to carry forward. And as the room remained still, the moment closed not with noise, not with movement, but with understanding, the kind that does not need to be announced to be felt by everyone present. The showroom did not return to what it had been, even as the seconds passed and the system settled into silence, because something deeper had shifted, something that could not be reset with a transaction or smoothed over with routine. And Darius Cole stood there for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because the room itself had not yet caught up to what it had just witnessed. The polished floors, the rows of cars, the quiet lighting, all of it remained the same. But the meaning inside that space had changed, redefined not by design, but by truth, and the people in the room felt it, even if they could not yet put it into words. The young employee behind the desk exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as if a weight she had been carrying without knowing it had finally been set down, her eyes moving once more across the system screen, now stable, now resolved, before lifting again toward Darius with something new in her expression, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but clarity. A customer near the entrance turned slightly toward another and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The moment had already spoken for itself, and the silence that followed was not awkward. It was understood. Darius finally shifted his stance, a small movement, but enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural end, and as he turned slightly toward the exit, he did not rush, did not carry urgency, just a quiet control that matched everything that had come before it. Before taking another step, he paused, just long enough to look once more at the space, not as a customer, not as an outsider, but as someone who had built something and expected it to stand for more than what it had just shown. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, but carried a depth that reached beyond the walls around him. "Power does not announce itself," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room. "It reveals itself in how it responds when no one is watching." And the words did not rise, they settled clear and direct, like a final truth placed exactly where it belonged. No one interrupted, no one challenged, because there was nothing left to challenge, only something to carry forward. Ethan Whitmore remained where he was, not moving, not speaking, but no longer resisting the reality that had unfolded, his silence no longer defensive, but reflective, as if for the first time he was seeing the moment not from his position, but from the perspective he had ignored. The employee at the desk glanced toward him briefly, then back to Darius, as if the alignment in the room had fully shifted, no longer uncertain, no longer divided, but clear. Darius took his first step toward the exit, measured, unhurried, and the room did not stop him, did not question him, because now they understood, not just who he was, but what he represented in that moment. And as he walked, the space behind him did not return to normal, it remained changed, marked by what had happened within it. Near the door, he paused once more, not turning fully, just enough for his voice to carry back into the room, calm, steady, final. "I did not need to prove who I was," he said. "I needed you to see who you were." And with that, he stepped forward, leaving the showroom not as someone who had been removed, but as someone who had revealed something that could not be unseen. And as the door closed behind him, The silence that remained was not empty, it was filled with understanding, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends, but stays, reshaping everything that comes after it.